Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Brit Mennuti. I'm a product manager on the Google AR/VR team. I'm joined here today by my colleague Bruno, a software engineer on the team. We have an awesome agenda ahead for you today. So by the end of today's session, you'll have helped us to demo an AR app. But before we get into that, I'll share a little bit of history as to how and why we built Poly. I'll share what Poly is and how it can be useful to you as a developer. And then I'll pass it off to Bruno to dive into the Poly API before we do the demo. Now, you may be wondering, what is this Poly thing and why should I care about it? Well, I think the best way to answer that question is to take a quick trip down Poly developer memory lane. The team that built Poly was actually originally devoted to the idea of productivity in VR. It was our goal to make people more efficient and effective at work using immersive technology. And we had a whole bunch of hypotheses about how we could do that. And we figured the best way to validate those hypotheses was to build a whole bunch of VR prototypes and test them with real people. We built everything like organizing your docs in VR to training people on how to use the espresso machine in our micro kitchen. But regardless of the prototype that we built, one thing was always the same. We needed 3D models. And finding the right 3D model was really, really hard, especially if we wanted a lot of 3D models that looked like they belonged together. So we said to ourselves, OK, no big deal. We'll make our own 3D models. Turns out, making your own 3D models is also really hard. In fact, what you see here on this screen is a model of a hand created by a software engineer named Chris on our team for one of our virtual meeting prototypes. Now, how many of you actually knew that was a hand before I told you?
I did.
I don't believe some of you. All jokes aside, this got us thinking that maybe creating models could actually be a lot easier. And perhaps VR was the answer to that. So we pivoted, and we built Blocks. Blocks is an app for the HTC Vive and Oculus Rift that lets you create beautiful 3D models in VR. And what makes Blocks special compared to other modeling applications is that you actually inhabit the same space as the thing that you're modeling. So instead of training your brain to think about a 3D object on a 2D surface, you can literally just walk around it. Thanks to the launch of Blocks, that same engineer, Chris, that I mentioned earlier, was able to make this beautiful fish tank model in less than 15 minutes. He also made this amazing robot workstation, all in Blocks. And I don't know about you, but I think that that robot hand looks a little bit better than the hand I showed you earlier. You might have also seen Chris in some of our launch videos. That's right, folks. One day you too can become famous. And as we were reflecting on Blocks, we started to realize there are a whole bunch of other resources for 3D assets that could be used in AR and VR development. For example, Tilt Brush is another VR app that lets you paint in 3D space. You can create everything from beautiful portraits to entire 3D environments, replete with both audio and visual effects. And we also knew that there was this vast community of 3D modelers out there, already making tons of assets that could be used in AR and VR development. So we thought to ourselves, maybe the problem wasn't that there wasn't an easy way to make models. It was also that there wasn't a single resource to find all of those assets to use for development. And that's why we built Poly. Poly is a library of 3D assets and experiences. And our mission is to organize the world's 3D information and make it accessible to creators and developers like yourselves. When you visit Poly, you'll see thousands of assets, some of which have been contributed by Google, but many more of which have been uploaded by a vast community of 3D modelers using Blocks, Tilt Brush, and other modeling apps. And when you upload your assets to Poly, you have the option to make them what we call remixable. What this means is that you give other creators and developers the right to use your assets under a Creative Commons by license. This means they can download those assets, use them in their apps, as long as they give you attribution. Well, the good news is that over 82% of public assets on Poly today are actually remixable. So what this means is there are tens of thousands of assets available for all of you to use today for free under a Creative Commons license. Now, when you go to Poly, you can browse by category. You can also search for exactly what you need. We recently added object recognition to search, so you'll find what you need even if it isn't manually tagged. And when you find the perfect asset, you can download the file. We offer downloads in the form of OBJ, and in some cases, FBX files as well. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds great, but can I actually find useful assets on Poly? Well, let's look through some examples. Maybe you need a sandcastle model for your vacation mode app. Or perhaps you want to recreate Noah's Ark in your living room. Or maybe you've always wanted to include a realistic version of your BFF Carl in your next game. Fun fact, Carl is actually a real human. He's actually one of the talented designers behind Blocks and Poly. Or maybe you're building an archaeology app, and you need a whole bunch of real 3D scans of historic artifacts. Well, thanks to a recent partnership between Google Arts and Culture and SciArc, there are a dozen of these actual artifacts hosted on Poly for you to download today. And finally, perhaps all you ever wanted was a politically correct cheeseburger. That's right, folks, this burger has the cheese in both locations. No matter what you're looking for, you'll find everything you need on Poly to create a unique VR or AR experience. Like this VR scavenger hunt game, created by artist and developer Harlan Perez. He built this using Blocks, Poly, and Unreal Engine. Or these AR apps. On the left, you'll see an app from developer Andrew Deutsch, where he takes beautiful flower models from Poly and puts them on an otherwise dismal New York City subway platform. Or on the right, an app from developer Ben Ferns that uses object recognition and the Poly API to retrieve low-poly versions of real-world objects in real time. Now, as we thought back to Poly's mission, it occurred to us that we might be falling a little bit short on the accessible portion. Having to go to a website and download an object every time you needed it for your development was perhaps not the most efficient solution. So that's why we built the Poly API. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Bruno to share more.
All right. Thank you. So we're going to talk about the Poly API and Poly Toolkit. There are so many ways that I could begin a presentation about an API. So when I asked for advice, someone said, why don't you start with an inspirational quote? You know, something somebody famous said that's relevant to the topic. So this is the one that I chose. A good API creates more problems than it solves. Does anybody know who famously said this and when? That's right. Nobody. Ever. And that's why anytime you're working with an API, there's a simple but fundamental question that you have to ask. And that question is why? Why would you use this API? How is my life easier or better if I use the Poly API? To answer that, let's go back a couple of decades. So I've always liked building games. So my friends and I would get together and we would try to build a bunch of games in the old computers of the time. We kind of knew how to do the code, but the problem that we had was that none of us really knew how to make art. We had no skills whatsoever. Like stick figures were already a challenge. But somehow we had very high expectations about what our graphics were going to look like. In reality, however, our graphics look more like this. Does anybody know what that is? It's a dragon, of course. But come on. If this is a valid hand, then that's a valid dragon. Now, you might think that my skills would have improved over time. However, you would be wrong. I am the kind of developer who uses cubes for everything. So with my skill level, I could theoretically make a game about a cube that shoots other cubes to protect the larger cubes from being hit by the smaller cubes, all against a backdrop of moving cubes. If you think that there's no way that that game is viable, if you think that there's no way that that's an actual thing, it's because you haven't played Cubic Pilot. Not only did I launch this, but Google, in some official capacity, actually endorsed this, because this is a sample for the Google Play Games API. Now, my point with all this is that we all have this book as developers in our shelf. It's at the top of my shelf. Everyone has it. It's a bestseller. It's called Apologizing for the Lack of Graphics. Now, sometimes, I know, we can get away with it. Sometimes we can do clever tricks in our games to make graphics unnecessary. My favorite one is claiming that it's magic. The dragon is invisible. But it doesn't work every time. Users end up noticing that we're doing this. Now, to some people, when I show them this, what they suggest to me is, why don't you just buy a collection of 3D assets? You could just buy a collection of like nice 3D assets, and then you don't have to use cubes or ugly dragons anymore. And then I say, well, this is the traditional model for asset acquisition. This model has a couple of problems. One of the problems with this model is cats, obviously. Maybe I should go into more details. All right, if you ever actually tried to buy a 3D model of a cat online, you know what I mean. You can't just buy one cat. You have to buy Super Cat Pack Deluxe Special Edition with 700 fully rigged and animated cats. It's very hard to find separate assets. The second problem is that sometimes you're still in the prototyping phase of your app. At this point in my app development cycle, I'm not even sure if I'm making a game about cats, or about spaceships, or even about cats that fly spaceships. It's a valid thing. So I need that flexibility to try it out with different assets. And the third problem is users. Well, as you know, users are fickle, and they don't know what they want. So what happens if you ship your app, and then I know it's unthinkable, but suppose that you never actually thought about cats at all during the development cycle of your app. And now, when it's in the user's hand at runtime, the users want to have a cat in the app. How do you do that? Well, you would need to somehow figure out a way to pull out a cat from a runtime API. So Poly, by contrast, has the flexibility that you need to try out with many different assets from Poly. It has a runtime API, which means that during runtime, you can go and search for cats and then present cats to the user or anything else that they want. And also, it's not a static collection. It's not something that you just compile once and then you only have that same assets. It's a growing collection because users are contributing to that collection all the time. If you see there, you're going to see that even I, with my limited skills, made my contribution. Can you guess which one is my 3D model over there? Any guesses? Well, it's actually none of them. I uploaded this cube. So whenever you're making a game and you need a cube, you know where to look. So we have this great collection of assets on Poly, and then on the other side, we have our apps, and we want to be able to consume those assets. So what's the missing piece in that puzzle? Of course, what we need in this is an API. So the API is how your app gets access to these assets in Poly. Now, naming is difficult in general in computer science, so we put a bunch of very creative people together to come up with a name for this API for Poly. And after several hours, we came up with Poly API. It's very precise. On a very high level, how does this API work? On a very high level, it's like a search API. Your app wants 3D assets, so it's going to make a search query. In the simplest case, that's going to be a keyword. For example, the app could say, I like cats. I would like some cats, please. And then the API would return some interesting cats for your app to consume. Now, what happens if you're not a cat person? Can you still use this API? And the answer is yes. Or what happens if you want to be much more specific about the kinds of animals that you want in your app? In that case, you can make a more complex request. For example, you could say, I'd like low complexity assets from the animals category, medium toothbrush, and I want to be ordered from newest to oldest. So you can make very complex API requests like that. You probably would not get any cats on this one, because as we know, cats are very complex animals. And if the user signed in, you also have the option of getting the user's own assets. So this means that you can get the assets that the user has uploaded to Poly, but hasn't published yet. So you can get assets in draft state. And you could use that, for example, to let the user add those to your scene. So we talked about the what, and we talked about the why. Now let's move on to the next W question, which is when. When do we use the Poly API? Fortunately, the answer to this one is much easier. How about now? So with that, let's do a live demo. You know what's the first rule of live demos on stage? It's you never do a live demo on stage. So I'm going to try and see if this will work. All right, how many people actually think that this demo is going to work? All right. How many people think this demo is going to fail? All right, a couple of people. How many people think it's going to fail in some like epic and embarrassing way, like something's going to catch fire on stage? Well, two people. That's not bad. All right, so here I have my demo app. So this is using AR Core and the Poly Toolkit for Unity. So first of all, this is just AR Core showing me the planes that it's tracking. So we have here this very nice carpet that AR Core is tracking. And now when I tap my finger on the screen, I'm going to place an object. And this object came from Poly, but it's pre-compiled into the app. It's like this little intersection. Now, since I don't want to like bend down to the ground, I have this hack where I can increase the height of this over here. OK. Oops, it's running away from me. There we go. So we have this little intersection. Now, the point of this app is just to add some objects from Poly to make it look more like a real city. So what's one thing that we could add to make it look more real? Cars?
How about some cars?
Yeah, cars. Cars make sense. All right, so I'm going to do a search query. So I'm just going to type car. I'm going to do a search. I made this keyboard myself. And then we're going to do a search. OK, so these are our search results. And now all we have to do is tap one of these cars, and now it's in our scene. I'm going to rotate this car a little bit. There we go. And I'm going to carefully place it here on one of our streets. There we go. So I actually put some, I wrote some scripts in this so that the cars actually do something. So if you click run, then the car will run. And now let's add some other cars. So go back to results. Let's add this one. And it's going to place it over here. All right. You may or may not have played more exciting games. But in some games, your goal is to like save the kingdom, save the world. In this game, your goal is just to make traffic as bad as possible. And the other mini game in this is how many cars can I put in the scene without them crashing into each other? My high score is 1. Let's see if I beat my high score. Wow, my high score is now 2. Let's add something else. What's something else that you would see in a typical city?
How about a boat?
A boat. Sure, why not? A boat. After all, this is AR. Searching for boats. Let's see what boats we have. All right, I'm going to add this cruise liner. Let's make it a little bigger. All right, I'm going to put this cruise liner here on the road. There we go. It's going to be driving on the wrong side of the road. But I think that's not the worst traffic violation that's happening here. Let's see. Oh, my high score is 2 now. Perfect. So let's add something else. I mean, we're not restricted to forms of transportation. It's getting close to lunch, so I'm getting hungry. Let's just add a jar of peanut butter or something like that. I'm just making this up as I go. So, jar. Oh, even better. All right. Let's put this here. So, giant jar of jam. Does anybody know what this is? Any guesses? It's a traffic jam, exactly. It's a terrible pun. Sorry. There we go. So this just shows how you can continue to just add objects from Poly into this demo. And I think nothing else surprising is going to happen in this demo, unless, of course, a dragon were to appear and set fire to everything. So for those of you who thought that something was going to catch fire, I think you were right, in a way. All right. So I'm glad that this demo worked. Thanks. All right, now let's move on to how do I actually use the API. So you have the Poly API on one side, and you have your app on the other side. And it's naturally cross-platform because it's a REST API. This means they can get access to it from any device that has access to the internet. So we support several platforms: Android, iOS, Unity, Unreal, Web. Today, we're going to focus our attention on the Poly Toolkit for Unity. So Poly Toolkit is just an SDK for Unity that lets you use the Poly API. So when you download and install Poly Toolkit, it becomes fully integrated into your Unity editor. So you're going to see that window, and on that window, you can browse for Poly assets. So you can see that's going to show you, by default, it's going to show you the featured ones on the website. But you can change the filters. So you could filter by object type. You could filter by category. You could say, oh, let me look at the stuff in the transport category, in the food category. You could also do a search. So there's a little search button there. So if you need a dragon for your app, you can search for a dragon. If you need a cube, if you need a cat, anything you want, just click search, and then you find the asset that you want. Then once you find some good asset that you want to import into your scene, all you have to do is click on the import button. For example, I just click on the import button, and now this garden is on my scene. And notice that this is already in your scene, in your project, and this is already a perfectly reasonable app. If you click play, it's going to run, and it's already like a full app. Of course, if you actually want the garden to do something, you have to write some code. Otherwise, it's going to be more like one of those contemplative gardens. But you know what's going to happen? You're going to ship this app, Contemplative Garden, on Google Play. And then the first thing that users are going to do is they're going to say, sure, this garden is very nice. However, I want a cat. That's what's going to happen. So to get the users their cat, you have to use the Poly API. You have to use the runtime part of the Poly API. So let's talk a little bit about the Runtime API. It allows you to browse, search, and download assets at runtime from your app. I have no idea what that blue robot is doing. This is an actual picture from what's going on in the data center right now. So this is an overview of how the Runtime API works. First, you have to create a request object. For example, you could create, the most typical one would be the Poly list assets request. This request object just encodes your search query. Then you pass that object to one of the API methods, for example, list assets. List assets just means I want to list the assets that match that search request. Then you're going to wait for the callback, and the callback is going to have the results for your search. And then based on that search, you have to figure out which ones you want. If there are several matches, you have to figure out which one you actually want to import. And then lastly, you call polyapi.import to import that into your scene. Start with a basic example. If you just do poly list assets request.featured, this is the default featured query. This means you want to get exactly what Poly is currently showing on the website. So featured assets, no specific category, no specific keyword. Just anything good that Poly is currently showing on the website. Then you execute that request. To do that, just call list assets. You pass your request. And then once you get a callback, you're going to get a list of assets that you want. And then you're going to choose among those assets in some way. For example, you could just let the user pick one of them. And then once you know which one you want to import, you just call polyapi.import and pass in the asset, and that's going to get imported into your scene. So now suppose that you want to do a keyword search. In our example, we want cats. To do that, you simply just set the keywords field of the request to cat, and that's it. Then you execute the request, and then you get cats. Now, by default, you're going to get assets from newest to latest, which is normally a good sorting order. But what if I don't want new cats? I want the best cats. In that case, you just set this sorting order to polyorder.best, and then you get from the best cat to the worst cat. What happens if you are more picky about the cats that you want? Well, you can fill in other fields. For example, you could specify the maximum complexity field and say I want medium complexity cats at most. Complexity just means the polygon complexity of the model. So if you're running an app in a performance-sensitive environment, you might just want low complexity models. If you're not particularly strained about performance, you could ask for high complexity models that are more realistic. You can also set the format filter, and you can request how many cats per page do you actually want. So again, it's getting close to lunchtime. We're getting hungry. So of course, the Poly API has a solution for that. You can request anything from our food category by using an API call. So if you set the category to food, then you're going to get everything from the food category. And so if we're really hungry, let's just set the page size to 100. So we want like 100 items of food at a time. And now the default ordering is newest to oldest. So chances are, if you run this query right now, you're going to get a freshly uploaded batch of cookies, which is nice. What happens if you're worried about the quality of the assets? maybe I don't want to serve just any cookies that anybody has uploaded into the site. I want to have some criteria. So you could just hire a team and have a team whose only job it is to search for assets and mark the ones that are good that you want to present to your user and the ones that are not. But we already had to do that work because that's what we do for the Poly website. So we decided to expose that in the API to make things easier. So we have a flag called Curation Status, and you can use that in your search query. This means that whatever asset has that set to true, it means that we, that are human reviewers, actually mark that as being a good asset. So if you trust our good taste, then you can use that flag to filter your assets as well. In terms of code, all you have to do is set curated equals true, and that will filter only by the reviewed assets. Now you're going to have a good problem to solve, which is you run the query, and now you have a bunch of choices for the user. You have a bunch of cats that they can choose from. So how do you actually let them pick a cat or a dragon or a car or anything else that they search for? Well, you could, in theory, just download all the models, import them into Unity objects, and then show them to the user, right? But this might be wasteful because you might actually spend a lot of memory and a lot of time downloading those, and then the user is just going to pick one and then never look at the other cats. So what's a more economical way to do this? Well, we have thumbnails. So the API allows you to download thumbnails for any assets in our API. So for example, if you have an asset from a list assets results and you want a thumbnail for it to show to the user, all you have to do is call the fetch thumbnail API call. And then you're going to get a callback with a Unity texture 2D that represents a thumbnail for that asset. You could do anything with that texture. You could map it to an object, or you could just convert it into a sprite and then display on the screen. This is what we do in our demo when we're showing the possible cars. So these are not the actual models. What I'm doing is I'm showing the thumbnails for the models. And once the user actually clicks one of them, and I'm reasonably sure that the user wants that car, that's when I actually import the model. Speaking of placing objects, what happens if you just place an object in the world? Well, if this was a traditional app, that's fine, right? The object is there on the scene, that's what you want. But however, if you're working in AR, you need to make sure that that object is anchored to some real-world surface. Does anybody know what you can use to do this? AR core anchors, yes, exactly. How did you know? So that's when the anchors come in handy. So when AR core detects a stable surface, it's going to report the surface to you through the API. If you want to add an object so that it's firmly placed on that surface, you use what is called an anchor object. So what you do is you import the object from Poly, and then you set its parent to the anchor object. So that means that the object will remain stable on that table. Even if you move the phone around, if you change the orientation of the phone, it's going to be firmly placed on that tabletop. Even if AR core improves its understanding of the scene, it's going to remain there. So how do you accomplish this in code? Well, after you import an asset, what you do is you set the active member to false. This is going to make it so that the object is invisible before the user places it. And then presumably you're going to show some UI for the user. It's going to say, well, tap the screen somewhere to place this object. Once the user touches the screen to place the object, then you do a raycast to figure out where the user hit. And when you do a raycast, you can figure out exactly what the pose of the raycast hit is. And that's what you use to create the anchor. Once you have that, you create the anchor. And then finally, you're going to set the object's visibility property to true so that the object begins to render. And that's all there is to it. Just import from Poly, set the anchor, and now you have this object in your AR scene. And Poly Toolkit has a lot of other features that we're not going to cover. So it does automatic rescaling of objects for you. It can convert units. So if your scene is in centimeters and the object is in meters, it's going to convert. And you can get the featured assets. You can get the user's own assets. You can get even the assets that the user has liked. You can change the material assignments if you have a different look for your app and you need specific materials. We even do automatic attribution generation, so you don't have to keep track of which objects you downloaded from where. We just automatically generate a copyright file that you can display in your app. So let's talk a little bit about what goes on behind the scenes. So this is the part that you don't have to worry about. This is what Poly Toolkit does for you. So what's the difference between the two foxes, the fox on the left and the fox on the right? Well, clearly, the fox on the right is sitting down, right? And the other difference between this is that one is a model and one is data. So model is a collection of polygons that you want to render on your scene. And data is just characters. The data represents the model. Now, Poly API, of course, only outputs data. And what Poly Toolkit does is convert the data into Unity models. For that, we need to establish a format. This is one of those things that could be easy, but in reality is not. Because apparently, nobody agrees on how to do this. This is a partial list of 3D formats from Wikipedia. Now, we had to start somewhere. So we decided to start with the most basic one, OBJ. So OBJ is a great format, and it has everything that you're ever going to need for 3D objects if it's 1995. For today's standards, it's a little underspecified. It has a bunch of non-standard extensions, limited material support. However, it is widely supported, so we do offer that format in the API. Now, to be a little more modern, we have GLTF. GLTF is more modern. It's display optimized. It has an ample expressiveness, so it can display, it can encode scenes, nodes, animations, materials. And best of all, it's a format that gets everything right. It's stable, it's future-proof, and it's unlikely to change in the near future. Just kidding, it's changed. However, GLTF2 gets everything right and is unlikely to change in the near future. So in practice, in the Poly API, we offer objects both in the OBJ format and in the GLTF2 format. So if you're consuming the Poly API directly, you can choose which one you want. So you can choose OBJ, you can choose GLTF2, and Poly Toolkit uses GLTF2 and imports that as Unity objects, doing everything automatically, including material mapping and material generation. All right, so we talked about Poly Toolkit for Unity. There's also Poly Toolkit for Unreal. And if you're developing a native app on Android, iOS, or web, we do also have samples on our site showing how to integrate with the Poly API on those platforms. So if you're developing, for example, for Unreal, this is an example of Poly Toolkit for Unreal. It's the same principle as the one for Unity. It's a fully integrated environment where you can download and then use Poly assets in your scene. If you're developing for Android, there's a sample that shows you how to include assets from Poly into a little and very simple AR app, where you just tap the screen and then you can include a specific Poly object on your scene. If you're using web, there's also a sample, and this sample uses Three.js. This is actually the easiest one because our Poly website is also built using Three.js. And as a fun fact, the guy who created Three.js is the one who wrote the sample. So this just shows the wide variety of experiences that you can build with the Poly API. For example, you're not restricted to just AR. So this is not just an AR toolkit. You can also build VR apps. You can build traditional 3D apps. This is an example of a simple escape the room app, a VR app that we made in the office a couple of months ago, just to show, just to try out what we could do with the Poly API and with Poly objects. One thing that you notice is that even though different people created the different objects in that scene, they somehow look nicely together. They look like they belong to the same scene. Then we also added some lighting for an extra effect, and we got that like cheesy, spooky atmosphere that we wanted. The puzzles aren't particularly hard. And I think I just spoiled the game for everybody, because now you know that the exit code is 714. Fun fact, when we actually tried to play this game in the office, the first person that we gave it to, they just put the headset on, and we said, you have to manage to find a way to escape the room through that door. And what they immediately did is to just walk through the door and won the game. Because what's to stop them? And then we had to be more specific for the second user. So you actually have to solve our puzzles before you walk through that door. That just shows you some of the design problems. Well, for me, of course, what it means is that I can stop using assets like that and maybe upgrade my assets to look more like that. Now, I'm not exactly a Dragon expert, but I can sense that there was some improvement in Dragon quality there. So if you're interested in trying out the Poly API and building applications with Poly, please visit our site, so poly.google.com, is the 3D gallery site where you can browse assets. Developers.google.com/poly is a developer site where you're going to find everything you need to start developing with Poly today, including all the SDKs, including the samples, documentation, and everything else that you need. So thank you very much, and we want to hear from you. So if you liked this session, please fill in the survey. If you didn't like this session, the survey is optional. And that's it. Thank you very much.